Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Young, and this session is called Unspoken, New Writing on Losing a Child. I'm joined today by writers Alison Blevins, Shannon Gibney, Chloe Yelena Miller, and Whitney Roberts Hill. As a preface to the readings, I'll remind you that although nearly 1/4 of all pregnancies result in the loss of a child, pregnancy loss has traditionally been considered a woman's issue and remains largely unexplored in contemporary literature. The issues like infertility, miscarriage, postpartum depression, and the grief associated with losing a child are themes that have also largely been neglected in literary works, both here in the US and abroad. Also neglected, the fact that Native women and women of color suffer disproportionately from poor pregnancy outcomes. The four authors whose work features in this panel employ poetry, journalism, essay, and the prose memoir to reclaim and foreground this central human experience, not just for women, but for their partners, families, communities, and societies in the US and Russia. We'll hear a reading from each of these writers today, and then have a brief discussion about publishing on these topics. In the interest of time, I'm going to read abbreviated bios rather than full bios, because you can find more information about all of our authors and links to their books on the 1455 Summerfest website. Our first reader today is Alison Blevins. Alison Blevins is the author of 3 chapbooks and 2 forthcoming full collections of poetry. She is the director of Small Harbor Publishing and a poetry editor at Literary Mama. She lives in Missouri with her spouse and 3 children. Welcome, Alison Blevins.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. Um, I'm going to read poetry this morning, and these poems all come from my book, A Season for Speaking, which explores my experience with infertility. When my wife and I decided to get pregnant with our youngest child, I was diagnosed with secondary infertility, and this is an infertility diagnosis after a previous pregnancy. The first poem I'm going to read is titled Early Menopause. All birds forget how to fly. Crows and blackbirds walk through parks and cul-de-sacs on invisible stilts. All schools chain their doors. Women and girls pray wordlessly in supermarkets between plastic forks and bottled water. All breezes stop whistling through the stray hairs on teenagers' necks. Wind purses lips and blows and blows. All is silent as a man in a black bowler hat. I watch my children play at the park. My son shoots a stranger's son with his finger. A girl drags a small stuffed dog behind her on a leash. The shot hits his temple. The bang is metal piercing flesh, a pin striking the casing of a round. The noise bounces off the spiral slide, picnic tables, grills enshrined in concrete. I can't explain why the skin folding between my legs is tight like a scar, why men now brush against me in crowds as if I am a shutter. I can't explain how it feels in the bowels, on the teeth, on the still smooth bits of the pit of my elbow. This is where it stings and hums when you suddenly disappear. The next poem is an ekphrastic poem, and it's based on the abstract painting Low Water by Joan Mitchell. How to explain infertility when an acquaintance asks casually. Think about what is green in green, how words like silver and bright sing off every stinging tight space. I eat, I sit, I repeat. All must have order. Line up the shoes, organize the bottles. Remember how some women drive their cars off cliffs into ravining water, children asleep, full and snug and shining in the trunk. These women, on these days, gold and glittering, must rejoice in flight. Air rushes their lungs. A chorus of women and falling and clattering metal sings all together. Water cascades and rises, foretells all the women and children dead, a history of female drowning. These are not your women. Think of the green in green, the color that rests just beyond your fingers inside, like dirt trapped under grass, like garlic sprouting, like a long dead bone turned to rock, tumbled through pulsing years, its ridges and bumps pressing your flesh, all the small plunges. Water cascades and rises, foretells all women and children. Spatter and spray cling but eventually disappear. How terrible it is to release something from your body. Eventually, I did get pregnant using reciprocal IVF. And the easiest way to explain this is that I got pregnant using my wife's fertilized egg. And much of the book explores the quite strange experience of being both infertile and incapable of having my own child while also still being pregnant. My own genetic child, I should say. Reciprocal IVF, or how to explain the similarities between ecstasy and loss. These months, I think God might be woman unnamed, creation unclassified by words. I cannot explain loving this child. She is not mine, or losing what cannot be lost. I cannot explain how infertility feels in all my small and deep spaces. I'm not the only mother to carry loss, lament arrival, mourn acquisition, like water swirled to mud, like all the gray evenings remembering orange. I can't explain the sadness to my wife, carrying what isn't mine, even to myself. Not even color or sound can explain. No refrain can breathe O's into the roundness, thick and opaque. Nothing can soften the pitch and frenzy of my motion. She moves inside me, of ecstasy and loss. A man in line at a movie theater once told me, "You can't love both God and living. Human history is one of incompatibility. The fall means we are always beetles struggling on our backs. How wondrous it must be to live for death. How beautiful. I cannot explain how it feels to take depths into my body, to become held by her hands, soft from never having said, I'm sorry, to spin without breaking, to give every word to the world, to swell and swell and swell and stitch it all together at her feet." This has a long title. By 4 months pregnant, surging hormones and lack of sleep disturb cognition, brain circuitry, and spatial memory. This is a poem about pregnancy brain, which is not unique to IVF pregnancies. These are the silent days. Is there a word for the emptiness of another person growing each day inside? How each growing ounce erodes another piece. That word must be something like the sound of a finger plucking itself across a fretboard from chord to chord. These silent days without words are like the sorrow of the resurrected at seeing their beloved again, wordless and familiar, as numbness spreading across a fresh red cheek, as numbness spreading in a child's chest after learning aging means not every fear will be comforted. As stories turn to humming, these silent days fill and fill themselves. No word exists to explain how one thing is two, the joy and the pain of every slow and pulling end. For mothers, this is true. The leaves are changing, no more beautiful than before, yet a season for speaking. Dust lifts and rolls from the fields in an unseen breeze. This is the last poem I'm going to read. The wordless, the unspoken, and unnamed. And much of the book also kind of grapples with religion, and I was really interested in how so many women in the Bible just have no name, and they play really interesting roles when they aren't brought to the forefront as they should be. The wordless, the unspoken, and unnamed. At 6 months pregnant, the limits of language make me cry about every sound. All the lowing cellos, sounds strung up on laundry lines, displayed like underwear flapping itself crisp and unopening. How the bow moves like wind across strings, every tinny brass, beaten into my palms, stalled and towed up my arms. I don't play an instrument, but I'm missing words to explain how every sound feels, how it feels to grow another woman inside me, how to explain God, mostly that. And the child with my hair and eyes I'll never someday have. How can sadness mean all this? The words, nameless as the water drawers, the damsels, the 10 concubines of David, all the unworded women, unmouthed and untongued mothers and daughters. Some word must exist to give language to all the women who exist only in the sigh and struggle, the shuffle on of boots and lingering lines, all those lost to silence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. Our next reader is Shannon Gibney. She's a writer, educator, activist, and author of 2 young adult novels that won Minnesota Book Awards in 2016 and 2019. Her new novel, Botched, explores themes of transracial adoption through speculative memoir. In 2019, the University of Minnesota Press released What God is Honored Here, Writings on Miscarriage and Infant Loss by and for Native Women and Women of Color, which Shannon co-edited with writer Kalia Yang. Please welcome Shannon Gibney.
Thank you all for being here. It's always, I think, so hopeful to me when people gather to discuss and dig into and experience literature and our responses to it. And then this is a topic that is, as Catherine said, it's just not talked about very much. So anytime that there's a space for us to share our experiences and connect, I'm very grateful. So I was going to just show you, my light is a little weird here, but this is the book that I will be reading from today. It's got a long title, What God is Honored Here, and that's taken from a Lucille Clifton poem. And the subtitle is Writings on Miscarriage and Infant Loss by and for Native Women and Women of Color. And University of Minnesota Press released this 2 years ago. Myself and my wonderful editor, Kalia Yang, my co-editor, I should say, put it together and collected the work of over 20 Native women and women of color around the country, talking about our experiences, which, miscarriage and infant loss affects many people, but many women and their partners, their families, et cetera, and other folks who carry children. But it's definitely disproportionately affects BIPOC women. So I'm just going to read from the introduction. I was going to put the link to the book in the chat, but I think the chat is just for us in the us presenters. But you should be able to find the book wherever books are sold. So I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction and then a little bit from my own personal essay. This is called Reclaiming Life, and this is written by myself and Kalia. Miscarriage, stillbirth, neonatal loss, fetal and infant death. None of these words were new to us. We were writers. We were women. We were daughters. We were mothers. We were on our way to becoming mothers. And yet our knowing the words could not prepare us for the experience of them. None of who we had been could have prepared us for who we would become in the wake of these words. Grief is a lonely place we have visited by ourselves, occasionally with others. Some of us have built homes to house our grief. Others shiver in the storms that break, unsure of where to hide, how to hide, whether they want to hide. Each of us in our own ways, and for many of us through our words, has encountered grief. All of us have awoken from despair, only to find ourselves forsaken on its shores. 6 years after the loss of baby Jules, a miscarriage at 19 weeks, even in the years after when I, Kalia, had given birth to a living daughter and 2 living sons, I still feel the ghost of him swimming inside of me late at night and early in the morning when the world is quiet and dark. When the bigness of the sky enters through the window of our bedroom, when my husband is on his left side lost in his sleep, when behind the wall of our bed I can make out the twists and turns of my sleeping children, my hands move high in my soft belly so I can feel the force of life within me. In the quiet space of possibility, baby Jules moves inside of me, no longer as low as he had been. In fact, less than in my womb, he now swims close to my beating heart. 4 years after my first daughter, CNA, died inside me at 41 and a half weeks, I, Shannon, feel her everywhere. She never made it into this particular world, but she made a home of me for 9 long months, growing and becoming. Cradling her long, thin body in my arms after she was born, I had a new knowledge of how love can cleave you from the inside out. Waiting, dreaming, hoping for a baby to take a breath who can never take a breath. Waiting for the truth to become something living. In the days, months, and years after, we both looked desperately for answers in medical studies, statistics, in literature, and in life for some response to our experiences beyond the immense loss. We were doing what we had been trained to do as writers, finding meaning in human experience. We looked near and far, but there were no satisfying medical explanations in our cases. Like the medical explanations, the statistics were not helpful in explaining what happened to us. In fact, they troubled us even further. According to the Center for Disease Control, or CDC, in the general population of the United States, 15 to 20% of pregnant women will experience a miscarriage in their lifetime, and stillbirths affect about 1% of all pregnancies. This means that each year, about 600,000 women in America experience losses, and about 24,000 babies are stillborn. In 2015, the overall infant mortality rate was 5.9% for every 1,000 births. This is already a high rate for a rich industrialized country such as the United States. But the numbers are even more disturbing when disaggregated by race. Again, according to the CDC, in 2015, infant mortality rates per 1,000 live births were 11.3% for Black babies, 8.3% for American Indian babies, 5% for Latinx babies, 4.9% for white babies, and 4.2% for Asian American babies. In fact, according to the CDC, a risk factor for miscarriage and stillbirth is, quote, being of the Black race. There is a growing body of research that confirms that the stress from racism that Black mothers, and we can assume other women of color and Indigenous women experiencing systemic oppression in this country experience through their lifetimes makes it more difficult to carry their babies to full term. In a 2017 article for National Public Radio, stress from racism may be causing African American babies to die more often. Ritu Chatterjee writes, in 2004, Richard David, neonatologist at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and James Collins, Northwestern University Medical School, published a study in the American Journal of Public Health, in which they reported the connection between a mother's experience of racism and preterm birth. They asked women about their housing, income, health habits, and discrimination. Quote, it turned out that as a predictor of very low birth weight outcome, these racial discrimination questions were more powerful than asking a woman whether or not she smoked a cigarette. That just stops me every time. It just, other studies have shown the same results. While the research is confirming what many of us women of color know about our bodies and our lives in a landscape where white supremacy's reach goes far and deep, it also points to the historical and ongoing medical research gender gap. I'm going to stop there for the introduction because I don't want to take up too much time, but I think it's important to give some context to this work and why it was so important for Kali and I to get at the first person, real, material, bodily experiences of Indigenous and women of color in miscarriage and infant loss. So I'm going to read now just a little bit from my essay in the collection. It's called CNA, which was my first daughter's name. CNA, the trip was good. And as I said in the introduction, I had a stillbirth at 41 and a half weeks, and my daughter was 10 days late. And I went into labor. And then I was working with a midwife. And so I called the midwife. I went in and they couldn't find the heartbeat. So then they rushed me to the hospital, and this is what happened next. When we reached the hospital, they pull up a wheelchair and make me sit in it. But I can walk, I say, but they shake their heads. They wheel me down several winding hallways with bright fluorescent lights and photos of lakes with cranes and geese. I try to steady my breathing, which I can feel is irregular. Finally, we come to the OBGYN ward, and they hurry me into one of the patient rooms. Bala, that's my ex-husband, my husband in this. Bala is instructed to sit in the waiting room. An ultrasound machine, which I have been hooked up to many times before for routine checkups, sits behind the bed in my room. We're just going to see what's going on, says the doctor, looking at me carefully in the eyes. She appears to be in her late 30s like me, and her thin blonde hair is pulled to the nape of her neck in a black plastic clasp. I nod. I don't want to be here. I lie down on the bed. The doctor sits on the chair beside me. She squirts some transmission fluid on my raised stomach, and an image of a baby lying on her back, feet up, comes onto the screen. The baby is not moving. The baby has no heartbeat. 2 more doctors come into the room and stand next to Amy, that's my midwife, who is seated in the corner. Okay, says the doctor with the ultrasound probe. So yes, the baby has no heartbeat. She puts the ultrasound probe down and stands up. I look from her back to the screen, and the baby still isn't moving. Okay, I say. I want to ask her how to get the heartbeat started again, but some part of my brain is telling me not to say that. I'm sorry, she says. I'm so sorry. I look to Amy, then each of the 3 doctors beside her. Discomfort drains their faces, though I can see they are trying hard to mask it. I wonder how it feels to have to tell a woman something like that, and then still be expected to remain professional. It must not be easy. I ask if I can go to the bathroom. Once inside the bathroom, I grip the sink until my knuckles are white and stare into the spotless mirror. The woman looking back at me has dark brown eyes that hold nothing. What was once a sharp chin is now round and plump. Her hair frizzes all over from the humidity. I turn on the faucet as high as it will go and flush the toilet. Then I scream. The woman in the mirror screams and lets go of the sink as she does it. She wonders if she is just a copy of herself today, and if her real self is back at home washing dishes. She does not want to go back into the patient room because she knows they will tell her what she has to do next. And she does not want to know what she has to do next. She does not want to leave the bathroom because she will have to say to her husband, "Our baby is dead." She does not want to call her mother because her mother will cry and nothing will make her stop. She does not like to see or hear her mother cry. She will have to rewrite the story of the pregnancy and the baby coming, the happy house, her young son so eager to be a brother. Now the story will center on a chapter in which the eagerly awaited baby dies in utero, never to be cuddled and warmed in her arms, never to scream and demand a diaper change, never to suckle her breast. The woman does not want that story. She is not ready for it, for what it will mean, not just now, today, tonight, but forever, for the rest of her life. The weight of that story could crush all the other stories of her life and the lives of those she loves. She does not want that. She is too tired and she wants to sleep. She wants to awaken. I place my hand on my belly and tell my baby I love her. Then I open the door. I shuffle slowly back to the room, telling myself this is real with every step. What do I have to do? I ask them back in the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon, so much. Our next reader is Chloe Elena Miller. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and their child. She's the author of Viable and Unrest. Chloe teaches writing at the University of Maryland Global Campus and at Politics and Prose Bookstore, as well as privately. Please welcome Chloe Elena Miller.
Hi. Thank you all. I had written an introduction, but I just want to say that I'm so moved by hearing you guys read, as I've been by reading the books and the collections. And I think, as we've all been saying, as hard as these pieces are to live and to write about and to read about, they really do form a necessary community to show our collective power and knowledge and what we need to survive, which is not being alone, and to be able to speak our truths and say who we are and what has happened, and then make these connections. And I know that when I miscarried, I really looked towards literature and I was trying to find some connections. This is where I talk about my book. So I'm going to read from Viable, which was published this February by Lily Poetry Review Books. And in the back, I put together books that were helpful at the time. Now there's so many more that I should add to the list, which was kind of similar. I had read Megan O'Rourke's The Long Goodbye about her mother passing, and she also looked externally towards all kinds of literature and put together the resources and discussed them in the book. So I tried to do something similar. So hopefully all of these books together help others going through similar situations to feel this connection or to understand others, or kind of understand life. So I'll be reading from Viable, which is the story of a miscarriage and then a difficult second pregnancy and postpartum depression. And then if there's time, one new poem. So I'm going to read the opening poem, Mid-30s. Pigtails undone, she hides behind her mother's legs, two tiny hands around one adult knee. Mother leans down, whispers in her daughter's ear. Child smiles, tilts her head, loosens her knee grip. I too know what I would say to a shy child, given the chance. This poem is titled Short Duet, Dualities. Unlike you, who stopped being 2 weeks ago, still tucked inside, points of light, almost fireflies searching for someone, mate or prey, but then empty air. My internal eye pressure flashes like an alarm. On the medical screen, a rounded sack galactic space debris, that particular quiet of a single heartbeat. Words, rhythms originate in blood flow, the opening and closing of chambers, internal iambic pentameter. Here I am, left with one song. The doctor probes, searches for you where you were. Removal. 3 vaginal abortion pills for $4.35. 1 sick day, generic pain medication, hot water bottle, and tea. The opening and closing, release. Goodbye, my sweet. The noun miscarriage conducts image like electricity. My mother pushed her baby in a tall red carriage. Here, sunshine, there, a new bonnet. Shocks seen and unseen beneath the tires. And I have a series of poems that are either English or Italian vocabulary poems where they seek to define a word through an image or metaphor. And this one is called English Vocabulary Eclipse. They pass through each other's shadows, Mothers gesture with ringed fingers, share sorrow in a stored language of muscle memory. When we held our infants, what did and did not come after. That precious sorrow visible in a bent arm, downturned face, the pause, the passing, the pause. And this poem starts with an epigraph from a song by Giovanotti, an Italian singer, titled Amami from the album Ora. And it goes, Amami come se fossimo soli al mondo, soli al mondo. And the title explains the song, which is, Love me as if we were alone in this world. Active voice. You stopped at 7 weeks. Passive voice. Were stopped. Subjunctive. Love me as if we were. Fragments. Alone. Love me. In this poem, Children's Pool Game, I had the opportunity to work with the composer Lawrence Pavelko, who took a number of the poems from this book, and she created a composition titled Baby Book. And she created these amazing songs for orchestras and then individual instruments, in which they played and sang some of the songs. And it was really fascinating to hear the kind of interpretation or translation of the poems into something so much longer, especially this very short poem, which I will read. Children's Pool Game. Even with closed eyes, we can find each other again. I'll shout, Marco. You'll shout, Polo. Okay? Marco. And this poem is much lighter. It's titled Pregnancy, and it's a collage from popular pregnancy books. And I was really struck right from the beginning how goofy the language was in every piece of advice, and all those what to expect when you're expecting to expect books. Pregnancy. Beat the clock. Get on the expectant express faster. Wondering when your eggs will be ripe? There's nothing you can do about your age. Eat healthy. Oysters may also hop up your fertility while raising the libido roof. To speed up his boy-making boys, have the male partner drink something caffeinated. Once you've overcome fertility problems and become pregnant, congratulations. You face a somewhat greater chance of other problems. And this is after he was born at 4 weeks. Startle. You startle me, a human displacing yesterday's empty space. Some call life a miracle, but hilltop gods didn't glue together dirt, olive branches, and marble with saliva to build you or the others. As our apartment door closes, your arms push back behind your head, hands thump against me or the crib, squinting eyes dart. That reflex to protect yourself, to survive against storms despite other humans. My instinct to protect you, to remove all inside doors, lay shag carpet, and hang medieval tapestries to muffle sound. To nail boards over the windows, hold you too tight in my arms as we hide under the crib. I'm gonna skip to the end and read the last poem. Which is titled Your Creation Story, and it has an epigraph by Richard Grant from a piece in the Smithsonian Magazine from a piece called Do Trees Talk with Each Other? For young saplings in a deeply shaded part of the forest, the network is literally a lifeline. Lacking the sunlight to photosynthesize, they survive because big trees, including their parents, pump sugar into their roots through the network. And this poem is titled Your Creation Story. That time your father was a stranger to me, he leaned against a statue of a man on a horse. The man's eyes sprouted from fallen seeds and rain. Your father and I said, hello, in the middle of a New York City square. He rolled up a newspaper. There were newspapers then, and we walked. I tripped over uprooted sidewalk slabs, city planning be damned. We ate outside, ignored the squirrels and pigeons. A few seasons later, we imagined the possibilities of a tiny seed with a full coat. You and I swelled outward as your coat split, and I found clothes that stretched. In an office built over subway tunnels, we saw your silhouette, lit as if science were magic. We heard your quickly beating heart, walked home, our footsteps adding to the rhythm. 3 weeks early that spring, you came into the dry world. This is all true, but also not, because so much is missing. Like the sun impossibly above us, here and not, warming us just enough. It comes to this. Your creation is yours. I was your home. Now we all nudge you forward, make room for you to see out. Balancing between the creek and trees, we walk the pipe path. Sometimes you run ahead, but we keep you in our sight. And this last poem is a newer poem, which I've been thinking a lot about what it means to have written these poems and to be reading them again years later, kind of how they reflect upon current life. And this is titled English Vocabulary to Mourn. Some hire moirologists to voice the echoes in an empty room. I'd be good at that, I thought. I mourn with a calendar, a hairpin, or recipe. Hell, this pencil. I say the words aloud. Calendar, hairpin, recipe, pencil. Objects easier to list than the names. But at the funeral, when my great aunt put her weight onto her palms to lift herself from the chair, thud onto her cousin's coffin and wail, I knew I'd later fail her in my grief. Years later, when I cried at her funeral, the cries turned to hacking coughs. A cousin said I'd ruin the funeral. Maybe I did. I apologized, sucked on the acidic lozenge she held out. But what if mourning is my engine? Sound almost muted, just a whir behind the t-shirt and jeans. My hands do what is expected, wash dishes, answer emails, instead of reaching down to thump on the dirt or dig. The earth waits. My son puts his head underwater, snaps his fingers, listens for the muddled sounds. He lifts his head. Can you hear it? He mimics the sound in splashes. I hear the bathwater become the sea. The engine of condensed time, the here and not braided together. It revs at night, loud enough to crack foundation until the deep waters reach sea level, equilibrium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Chloe Elena Miller. Our next reader is Whitney Roberts Hill. She is a writer, editor, and teacher. Her work has appeared in numerous journals. With Elizabeth Ferris, she co-edited the anthology Unspoken, Writers on Infertility, Miscarriage, and Stillbirth, published by Life in 10 Minutes Press. Whitney lives in Richmond, Virginia, with her husband and infant son. Whitney.
Thank you, Kate. I think I might be on a bit of a delay, so I really hope you guys can hear me. I'll be reading from Unspoken today. I'm reading from the introduction, which I wrote, hoping that can frame some of our thinking about language. And then I'll be reading a tiny piece of my personal essay. Introduction, a word about language. When I was a child, I loved to stand out by the jetties at Garden City Beach in South Carolina, across the street from my grandmother's house, a towering stucco row house carved out like a slice of wedding cake, plunked down between the inlet and the ocean. I would walk along the beach, low, where the sand was packed hard by surf, and notice the edge of washed up reeds and detritus, the tide mark, evidence of where the water had been and would come again. I loved standing at the edge, watching the wavelets, sometimes falling short, sometimes surpassing their predecessors. During those meditations on the edge of the water, I tried to use my mind to control and predict what the next wave would do. I wanted to be the energy force, to quicken what I knew was coming, to use my mind to pull the water up and over my bare feet. I felt that same impulse when it came to the language used in this book. I know that the landscape around childbearing loss is changing. Those who have experienced it are sharing more than ever before. And many of them are seeking a new vocabulary to describe their experiences because they have found words like infertility, miscarriage, and stillbirth patriarchal or insufficient. I wanted this book to be a part of that transition to a new language, to pull on the tide hard like the moon. There is no singular word for the parent of a child who has died. There are terms for other such persons marked by loss, orphan or widow, for example, bereaved mother or bereaved father, but some of us don't feel like we can lay claim to these monikers. Am I still a bereaved parent if my child never took a breath? What if their heart never had a beat? What if they were only a dream that never materialized at all? From the moment my first baby died inside me, I began searching for the language to describe my experience. The day after I came home from the emergency room, I lay in bed writing out every detail, some of which I later shared, desperate for the life I had harbored to leave a mark on the world. In the months that followed, I went searching for others who had traveled a similar road. I was trying to find a book like this one, a collection of stories companionable with my own. Friends and family members alike faltered in their attempts to comfort my husband and me. They held their flimsy words up, ill-equipped by our culture to say much more than sorry for your loss or you'll have another baby. Some cast their words aside unoffered. Those who didn't acknowledge our grief made us feel most isolated of all. The medical industry has a different set of horrible words for what befell me and has befallen so many others. Threatened miscarriage, my hospital discharge papers read, as though I had stood them all up at gunpoint, crazy-eyed, threatening to drop my forming baby on the cracked linoleum floor. And later, no evidence of pregnancy, as though none of it had ever happened. In the early days of this book, Elizabeth and I were tasked with deciding what to call it and how we might talk about the breadth of kindred griefs we wanted to collect here. We traded ideas, feeling keenly the clumsiness of the available language, wishing we could invent something better than the words we've been given to talk about these things. Miscarriage is threaded with culpability and patriarchy, as if a mother is to blame for failing to carry her baby. Pregnancy loss evokes absent-mindedness. Infertility is not just the lack of an experience or state, but an experience or state of its own, specific, grueling. And stillbirth speaks nothing of the gauntlet of labor or the perfection of rosy-lipped newborns without breath. But the tide has not turned yet. These are the words with which our culture is most familiar, and so we use them, hoping their familiarity would make these stories easier to find, asking for forgiveness from the generations to come who will no doubt invent better names. For now, in order to speak the often unspoken, we use the old words. Our hope is that they send out a beacon to make these stories findable in the deep sea, to let the next mother, father, brother, sister, or grandparent know they have companions on this road. None of us is alone, and we don't have to be silent any longer. I'm going to read a small excerpt from my essay in the book. The essay is entitled Motherline, and it's a braided essay, so it involves the experience of my first miscarriage, and also the experience of finding out when my step-grandmother died at 94 that she had had a baby decades earlier that none of us knew about, who lived for 36 hours. And her dying wish was to be buried with her baby. And then there's also a component of exploring different religions that's woven through the piece. We should name him, I said to my husband. He was a him, a boy to be born in August, a Leo. None of this felt right exactly. I'd always intuited I'd have a daughter first, and the intermingling of a Sagittarius and a Gemini hardly seemed like a Leo. I would have gotten used to being wrong about these things. I would gladly be wrong about them and meet my son in the late summer heat. I would give almost anything. I decided we should name him because I found it hard to say the sentence, I'm thinking about the baby, or I'm missing the baby, or I'm sad about the baby. I needed a shorthand to help my mouth form around the truth. I needed a quicker way to say, I know I look like I'm on the shore, but I'm actually drowning again right now in front of your eyes. I'm thinking about calling him Lion, I said to my mother. That's sweet, she said. I like it. I was having trouble coming up with a real name for him, both one that I liked enough to choose, and if I'm being honest, didn't like so much as to waste on a baby whose name would likely never be uttered outside our home. Waste seems like the wrong word, but I don't know what the right word is. I keep thinking of an A name, my husband said. Aslan, Ari, Andy, short for Leander. These are A names that mean lion. He who taught me how to roar, who woke me up to my animal self, the carnal mother, who splinters furniture into matchsticks and pounds the floor, and wails and screams and pulls her own hair and paces on her muscled legs. When I gave birth to Hen, little shiny red sack that held him, he gave birth to her. On the night of his enlightenment, the Buddha is said to have roared like a lion. When I was a girl, I had a woven cotton blanket with the image of a lion laying down with a lamb. I had a leather-bound Bible embossed with my name in gold, filled with visions of hell and paradise. Isaiah chapter 11, verses 7 through 9. And the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play by the cobra's hole, and the weaned child shall put his hand in the viper's den. They shall not hurt nor destroy. I find baby Preston's death certificate on a genealogy website, connected to a little box that said infant boy Riddick. I click on it and a document appears before me. She named him Preston for his father and Elvington for her own family. Baby Preston was also a Leo. The kindredness I feel with Marion now isn't just with her. I have been inducted into a lesser known chamber of motherhood by the death of my baby. And among its inhabitants are also my own mother, who lost 2 babies, and both of my biological grandmothers, who lost 1 each. A shadow genealogy, a line of invisible mothering. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Whitney Roberts Hill. We're going to close today with a different reading. I'll tell you about myself. My name is Catherine Young. I am the author of 2 poetry collections and the editor of Written in Arlington, Poems of Arlington, Virginia. But the reason I'm here today is because I am the translator of several literary works from Russian, including the one I'm going to read from today, which is called Look at Him by Anna Starobinets. Let me tell you a little bit about this book. We're reading in the 3rd chapter. Anna Starobinets is known as Russia's Stephen King, although she also writes sci-fi and work for children, and she's a journalist. And the book, Look at Him, tells the story of Anna's unborn son, who is diagnosed in utero with what turns out to be bilateral multicystic dysplastic kidney. And what that means is that basically the kidneys develop cysts and they swell up to many times their normal size. There is very little amniotic fluid, and the enlarged kidneys keep the baby's lungs from developing properly. So this condition is invariably fatal. Although the selection that I'm reading from today doesn't mention it, the first 2 chapters of the book chronicle the dismissiveness, lack of empathy, and sheer misogyny of the Russian medical system. Anna receives the news of her son's fatal birth defect while she's lying on the examination table, half naked, and she's undergoing a transvaginal examination in front of a large group of medical students, and she was not even asked to consent to their presence. The fatal diagnosis is made clinically to the students as a teaching point. The diagnosing doctor does not speak directly to Anna or express any empathy or sympathy. At the point in the memoir where this chapter 3, picks up, the family, which consists of Anna, her daughter Sasha, who goes by the family nickname Little Badger, and her husband, who's also named Sasha and goes by the nickname Big Badger, has just processed the diagnosis and must decide what to do. Let the baby come to full term, when he will die in excruciating pain shortly after birth, or terminate the pregnancy. Chapter 3, Just a Fetus, from the memoir Look at Him by Russia's Anna Starobinets. Little Badger is an optimist. She believes that a miracle will happen for us and littlest Badger will be born. For her, this is probably the stage of denial. But it's important to her that I believe as well, as if my faith could fix things. She follows me around like a shadow. But don't you believe just a teeny bit? Don't miracles happen? Don't you believe even a smidge, even 1%, even a whisker? I don't know how to answer her, so I say what I'm thinking. I don't believe. Not 1%, not a smidge, not a whisker. My stage of denial has already passed. Probably it's cruel, but I don't want to give little Badger hope. The more hope there is now, the worse it will be later. They say the second stage of grief is anger. It's not that I'm angry, but I want to know whose fault it is. The main person, the one whose fault all of it is me. I run through these 16 weeks in my head and find many sins. I didn't rejoice to the necessary degree at the conceiving of new life in me. The preggy-weggy pregnant women write in online chat rooms, "When I saw those 2 cherished lines, my joy knew no bounds." That's their mantra, their incantation. It's like the beginning of a prayer, as if there's a special deity who monitors their chat room and who must be appeased. And I didn't appease the deity. I did things wrong in general. There were limits to my joy. When I saw the 2 lines on the test, I felt scared. It's true that at my first pregnancy, which resulted in little Badger, I also felt scared, but that's not important. This time, I felt even more scared. Furthermore, I drank wine the night he was conceived. I smoked. I didn't eat regularly. I didn't go swimming, worked too much, wrote a new book, wrote a screenplay, wrote articles, and now I also need to write. Up until this nightmare began, that is, until 3 days ago, I was working on a long article, moreover on deadline. But now I can't write anything. I send the editor-in-chief an email about birth defects and about the fact that I can't do anything right now. The response arrives, of course, we'll postpone it. That article is about children the social service authorities want to remove from their family. Because their home is dirty, there are cockroaches, dogs, cats, rats, and fleas. Because the place stinks. Because their mama takes in every stray animal she sees. Because at some point, the social service authorities also took their mama from her own mama, and she grew up in an orphanage and has no understanding of what a normal home is. I want to stand up for them, to write that families can't be separated, that the vicious cycle of being an orphan must be broken, that these children are attached to one another and their mother, no matter what, and that they can't be taken away, that a social worker must work with them, that although they stink, they're happy. In an orphanage, they'll be clean and unhappy. I spoke with volunteers and psychologists. I visited them in their stinking, vagrant hovel. It's their fault. They infected me. I was there during the first trimester at exactly the stage when the organs form. It's her fault, their criminal, dim-witted mother. She has 4 children and doesn't bother about any of them. How can she live in a dump but give birth to healthy children? How can her sons live and mine not survive? Because I didn't have to visit them in their unsanitary state. It's my fault. But then again, no. Polycystic kidney disease is a genetic illness. It's impossible to be infected with it. So it's my fault, not because I visited that hovel, but for a different reason. I know why. I committed a sin, the most important sin. I once said I didn't want him, didn't want a second child. I said that maliciously during a fight with Big Badger. Words have power. It was sometime during the 8th week, probably at exactly the stage when the kidneys were forming. Big Badger. It's his fault that I said that. And besides, he said the wrong words. He said it was a bad time, that we had too much work right now. You didn't want him, I attacked Big Badger. You said he'd mess everything up. Well, are you happy now? Big Badger says, no, I'm not happy. In fact, I wanted him too. And he adds helplessly, I wanted to play soccer with him. I'm ashamed, but I want to keep picking at this some more. And now there won't be any baby, no baby. And then he tries to persuade me that it's not a baby, but a fetus. A fetus can't exist outside my body. A fetus doesn't yet live in the full meaning of the word. He argues, he insists, he wants to comfort me, but I fall into despair. My baby is alive, he kicks, he stirs around. I shout, "Don't you dare call him a fetus. He's a person." Fine, but can I call him an embryo? Embryo sounds better. We conduct a teleological argument about the soul of an embryo. My husband, who was baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church, insists that an embryo probably doesn't have a soul. I, who was never baptized, insist that he has a soul, and that I feel that soul, an additional pure soul inside of me. Fine, says Big Badger. It's clearer to you. He gives in simply to soothe me. He continually gives in to me and soothes me. He cooks, he goes to the store, he washes dishes, he prepares little Badger's inhaler and gargle for her throat. He works, he begs me to eat, he hugs me and strokes my head and says, "I'm here." He talks on the phone with my parents and his parents. I lie around and weep, but like the wolf in the old video game, he tries to catch all the eggs in all the baskets. He's here. However, that little boy with enormous kidneys isn't inside him, but inside me. It will fall to me to kill him very, very soon, or else it will fall to me to carry him to term and to watch as he dies. That's Anna Starobinets from Look at Him. I'm going to turn now to we have some time left and we're going to do some questions, but I do want to say a word first. We have really concentrated today on infant loss, but of course I want to acknowledge that this is not the only way to lose a child. Written in Arlington, the anthology that I edited of the poems and poets of Arlington, Virginia, for example, I included a poem by Kathy Haley that mourns her late daughter, Alexandra Delane Haley, who died in her 20s. I have not fully explored literature about losing an adult child. There is a good amount of it. I'll just mention one work, Mary Jo Bang's Elegy, but there is much out there. So I'm going to start with some specific questions for each of our readers, and then we'll go on to some general ones about this topic. And I think I'll start with Allison. Allison, you have work on IVF and miscarriage, not just in the poems in A Season for Speaking, and some of those same poems appear in Whitney's anthology, Unspoken, but you have it in, those same topics are included in your other work, including two of your forthcoming books. And I was hoping you could speak for a minute about this notion of mining one's sorrows in this way, and sort of leading to a broader question. Does doing this kind of work, does writing about these things and reading it in public, does it do what writers often say they want to do, which is to help heal you, the writer, or perhaps help heal those who hear the work?
That's a big question. I guess I don't know. I think the inspiration or the drive to write about trauma is what informs all of my work. Unfortunately, I think people often, write from joy, write from, these other emotions that humans are burdened with, and that works for them. But for me, just circumstance has placed me in a place to kind of write often about trauma. So I do think it heals me in the way that I can't stop doing it. So there must be something to it, why I keep doing it. And uh, when I finish a book, or I think of them as like trauma projects usually, and I say, I'm going to write about this. And then when I finish, it feels like I can say, okay, now I'm done with that. Now I've picked at that sore enough that I can move on. And I think people deal with emotions, in lots of different ways. And people who aren't writers, I'm sure, find ways to kind of put things away, to file it. But for me, it's always been through writing. And the reading of it is, I'm not sure, in sometimes the reading of it in this way with this group of, we've been reading together a few times now, and it feels like community. It feels like group therapy in some way. But when I do it individually, it can often be, you're revisiting the trauma. And so I don't know. I hope it is healing for other people, because I know hearing your stories, it makes me feel less alone. And so I think when I do those readings, it's a way of like saying to people who might connect that here's a way to connect. Here's a way to see yourself in somebody else, and hopefully they are healed by that. I've never really thought of it in that way. So it is encouraging, maybe, that is doing that.
All right. Chloe and I both went to a women's college, and we are kind of used to sort of looking for help and sustenance in groups of women. And I am wondering, and this is something I hope all of you will address as you speak to the other questions, is, to what extent is support and community gender-based, if it is at all? And what are your experiences in terms of audience response to the work, specifically having to do with gender? And also perhaps people who have experienced this in their lives versus people who have not. And does that affect the way that they respond to your work? I want to ask, though, specifically a specific question to Shannon right now. And that is, to what extent, if any, did you envision creating the anthology, What God is Honored Here, as advocacy work or perhaps social justice work? Because beyond the stated goal of collecting work by Native women and women of color, whose voices have generally been little heard, despite the fact that these communities suffer disproportionately from poor pregnancy outcomes, were there other goals in creating the anthology? And I'm also curious if you think any of those goals have been achieved.
Yeah, hi everyone. This is my son, Boise. You can say hi. Yeah, thanks for having us, including us in the circle. It's been a really, thank you for that really thoughtful question, Catherine. Definitely Kalia and I think, conceived of this anthology as a template for building community to process trauma, and to process unprocessed trauma. I think of the work of artists of all kinds, including writers, as creating space where there isn't space, and specifically space for connection, because I do feel like, one of the big effects and goals of all systems of oppression, including patriarchy, including white supremacy, including heteropatriarchy, all of that stuff, is this idea that, art comes from, the single individual, and that it's really this, kind of like white male, cisgender experience. And, generally, as women, we know that, and as people of color, right, as anybody who's like in a non-dominant identity class, it's like, we know that that's not true at all. Art comes straight from community. And I know myself as a transracial adoptee, which is, for those who don't know, that it's the way that it occurs mostly is Native and people of color being adopted by white families, usually even an upper level class. Throughout my life, it was very isolating, structurally isolating, to not understand that there were these other people out there that were having this other kind of experience, that a lot of other people just weren't. And so it took until my mid-20s to really find that community and to find language for my experience. And once I did, it was very empowering, and so I think that is how I approach living, but it's also how I approach my art, in every sense. And so, Kalia and I, Kalia's an amazing writer and speaker, and she wrote The Late Homecomer, which is an amazing piece of work. It's a Hmong family memoir, and it really just sort of busted open, again, this sort of narrative vacuum of the Hmong experience, both in Laos and in the refugee camps, and then here in America. Yes. And so, with that, she and I in the Twin Cities where we're based, we're following each other's work and really admired each other's work and work in the community as well for years. And then she saw that I had my loss. I saw that she had her loss. And I asked her, not right now, because it's still so raw for both of us, but at a later state, would you consider a project like this, pulling together these first person narratives from Indigenous and women of color about our experiences? And she said, absolutely. And then it was really like the ball starts just rolling on its own. We put feelers out to our networks and did a national call, and the work just came, and that really shows you, I feel like that you're tapping into something that really is bigger than yourself. And that is really needed. People are just sort of waiting, for this moment. And since the book's been out, sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. It's been incredibly moving for all of us to kind of see the response, and not just from women, but from, like what Whitney was talking about in her story, right? Like, there's a lot of men who have these losses, and there's no place for them to talk about them, and I remember in particular a middle-aged Native man, and he was like, my mom had the baby before me. She lost the baby before me, and she mentioned it, but I didn't know. He's like, I didn't know what that meant until I really read the book and started talking about that, and I'll wrap it up because I want to give other people space, but it's been incredibly moving since the book's been out, especially with older women, I think, who have approached us after the readings and have been like, this is the first time that I could really, we have this language that's really sort of, some of the other writers here talked about it in the, Chloe in the, books on, what to expect when you're expecting, and like all the, sort of, I think it might have been Whitney's piece that talked about the chat rooms and like this language that to me sort of, and Kalia, like obfuscates. It doesn't reveal the real experience, yes, and the pain, the hurt of losing a child. And we've had these women come up to us, after these events, these readings, and they're just like, this is the first time that I could actually say my baby died. I always had to say all this other stuff to make everybody else around me okay somehow. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. I'm going to piggyback on that and ask Whitney a question now, because it's from her introduction, and she mentioned a little bit of it today. She writes about the inadequacy of language commonly used for what we call infertility, miscarriage, and stillbirth. And of course, you, Whitney, say that this language is patriarchal and insufficient. So I want to ask everybody, and so I'll start with you, Whitney. How do you envision new language for these life events? How should it sound? How could we possibly find words for the events that we've been talking about today?
Thank you for that question, Kate. The way I see it is that these particular kinds of losses are kind of at an intersection of the absence of language. So in one way, our culture is just really terrible at grief. And so we don't have a lot of language about grief in general. It's also true that, like you said in your introduction, these are often considered women's issues, women's losses, and therefore not a part of the main narrative. And of course, Shannon's work really highlights that that's disproportionately women of color and Indigenous women who are even further removed from the main narrative and further removed from the people who keep language in our culture. I think it's also true that I think a lot about the kind of invisibility of many of these experiences. And so in particular, in putting together Unspoken, we had to kind of decide the boundaries of the kinds of losses we were going to include. And so we include infertility, miscarriage, stillbirth. There was one experience of infant loss, and that's expressed by the infant's father. We really looked for men who would talk about their experience. Very hard to find them. And then we have a couple of stories of termination for medical reasons, similar to the memoir, Catherine, that you translated. And so many of these particular kinds of losses of children are an internal experience of the woman, in the way that pregnancy is an internal experience. So at a certain point, it becomes this kind of performative public experience. We have, like Chloe mentioned, the pregnancy books. There's also a different, strange vocabulary that starts to happen around pregnant women in public spaces and the things people will say to you as a pregnant woman in a public space. Until that, it's a totally invisible experience from the outside, right? Until you start to show as a pregnant woman. It's a personal internal experience. And so I think because of that, there is a necessity of language, right? Language is how we translate those invisible experiences into something visible, tangible, physical, so that other people can experience them also. And so I think language is so important in these kinds of losses because I'll speak from my own experience. Both of my losses were early miscarriages. And so there was nothing, I had no physical anything to represent my loss except my own words about my experience. I had no ultrasound pictures. I had nothing. I had some terrible documents from a doctor's office and a hospital, but that's it. And so I had this real need to make my loss visible, to make my experience real and substantial and physical for other people. And language was the only means I had to do that. And I don't have a great answer about what that language should be going forward, except to echo something that Shannon just said, which is my personal take on it is to not mince words and not use these other terms that we have for what's happened, and to just say, I had 2 babies who died. Because that's the truth of my experience, right? That's not how we describe it to other people, because we kind of create this gradation of grief and loss, and some are worse than others, some are more real than others. But my internal experience was I had 2 children who died. And so that's how I talk about them. And I think maybe we don't need special words. Maybe special words are the problem. So yeah, I love this question, though, Kate. Thank you for asking it.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that very briefly before I ask a couple of other questions on the specific question of what we should call these experiences? Are there better ways, better things, better terms we could use?
I wanted to just mention that I think what Whitney said was really important, that you said you wanted to make that loss visible. And I think that was something that I was really interested in and have been when I write about this topic, is that I was pregnant. And so I wasn't supposed to be grieving or feeling this loss, and yet there it was, and everyone around me felt like, you should be happy now. And in many ways I was in this process of grief, and I think we've all sort of said this, that we are told by outside forces, who is it acceptable for you to feel grief, and how women feel this sort of performative aspect of pregnancy and loss and grief, and how we're supposed to all be smiling and cheerful. And I thought, Whitney, that was really important, that maybe there aren't words specifically, but that we even acknowledge the limits of what is acceptable for women as childbearers, or just as women in general. And I think that, to kind of back to the question you asked me initially, I think maybe this is the answer for me, at least, but that there certainly aren't a word or a term, but that poems themselves for me, because that is my creative outlet, become the word. And you can see that struggle in a lot of my poems, that the whole poem is about saying there isn't a word for this, but that I hope this poem becomes the expression of that experience. So maybe creative work in general, whatever it is, it becomes the new word to describe some of this stuff.
That's a good segue into my next question, because I wanted to ask Chloe, we've been talking about anthologies largely today, and then the memoir is a full book, but Chloe's got a single work, a collection of poetry devoted specifically to miscarriage and its aftermath, including a new pregnancy. So I will ask you this awful question that I ask when visiting writers come, which is it what writers call a project? In other words, did you conceive of this as a project with parts that you were going to put together, or did the poems come together on their own? And I really also want to ask, what was the driving desire that you had in creating this collection of poetry, two collections of poetry now?
So first, I love that you asked how I conceived of it. No, I had no idea it was going to happen. I was just probably like most of us, writing and writing. And I actually recently noticed I had been putting all of these poems on this subject into one document. And then more recently, I've been looking through poems I wrote on other subjects during the period. And there were a lot of them. But I think I kind of instinctively knew to separate them from the beginning and say, these are these hard poems, here are some other poems, and the others aren't all on one subject. So I definitely didn't set out to do that. But I did, in the editing process, once I realized there was a good chunk of them, realize how much I was writing the same poems over and over and over, and really removed a lot of them, and then hopefully chose the stronger ones to kind of represent what else needed to be written to get to that point. Yeah, and it ended up being one thing. Back to the idea of language, one kind of big fear that I had as I was writing and thinking about this is the issue of being pro-choice and abortion, and the right to make different choices for unintended or intended, and then not able or wanting to continue with the pregnancy, and thinking about how the language works there, and calling an embryo or a fetus, like in the memoir, a baby, and thinking about that loss versus also being fiercely pro-choice, and knowing that different people are making different choices. I don't really know how to resolve that problem. I think what Whitney was saying about your own choice and your intentions and our own lived experiences is how we can come to that. But that can definitely be misinterpreted by everyone at any point.
I think we're going to wrap it up soon. I do have a final question that I'm actually going to take myself. And that question is, where do these works go from here? Which is to say, this question originally came from Chloe. Griefs change with time. How do we look at them now? And what do we expect or need from them in the future? And I just want to give you a little bit of history on the book, Look at Him by Anna Starobinets, which is what I read from. She lost her son in 2012, and the book was published in 2017. And it was, Starobinets is a very important writer in Russia, and this book was a conscious attempt to break the taboo about these matters in Russia, and also to reform the medical system there, which treated her so terribly that she eventually flew to Germany for medical care. In interviews about the book, Starobinets has talked about the sort of Spartan way of being, this ethos of suffering in Russia. And that is, if you break down, if you show emotion, you are somehow weak and unworthy. And when she was looking for help after the death of her son, she found out that things that we take for granted here in the US, like support groups and therapists trained in grief, those things didn't even exist in Russia for women in her situation, for families in her situation. And so this book, which is all about a woman and a family breaking down, shocked the Russian reading public when it was published. People called it disgusting and unliterary, and no one had ever published anything like it. And she was abused continually in very public and hurtful ways. I recently put together a panel with Starobinets and some of her other translators last month, and I asked her whether she was sorry that she'd published the book, considering everything that has happened to her afterwards. No, was her answer. The book has made change in Russia. some of the medical practitioners who treated her badly, and she named them in the book, they have retired or they've been disciplined. And her book is now required reading for medical students. So her wildest dreams of changing the world with just her words really has become a reality. So I guess I wanted to sort of share that with everybody as sort of a way of thinking about what we're doing here, what the possibilities are, what we can do with our words. And I guess I can give everybody like 30 seconds quickly to just say, maybe weigh in on this question of where does your work, where does this work, where does this creative work that we've all shared today, where is it going? What do we expect or need from these works in the future? And I throw that open to anybody.
I really appreciate that context. And I also really appreciate the fact, Catherine, I've never been actually on a panel that has this international perspective on this particular issue. So I so appreciated that. I've learned a lot. And I'm going to check out that work. But I was just telling somebody yesterday, there's many facets to being a Black woman, but that, writing is basically my greatest source of revenge. And so, I was talking about something else where, Child Protective Services was called on my family, basically because of ethnocentrism and racism. And so I wrote about that in an essay. And so I feel like when you're in the lower social order, creative expression and critical expression is really is a way that you can affect social change, right? In the ways in which this writer in Russia has, but there's a price, there's always a price to it. And again, but I just feel like by creating more space and making the work as aesthetically excellent as possible too, it just creates more space. People feel like, wow, this is an issue that really deserves a whole book,
Anybody else? We lost you, Shannon. Anybody else want to? Yeah,
if Shannon's finished, I'd love to jump in and just say that part of our intention in making Unspoken, we had several audiences, one of which is other people who have experienced this sort of loss. Another is people that have not experienced this sort of loss. And my own work and the work in the anthology, my hope is that in the next generation, this kind of loss will not need to be explained in order to be validated by our culture. And so I just hope that it goes out into the world, that I think Shannon mentioned, talking to a man whose mother had a loss and he never understood it until he read her anthology. That's really, I look at this, my essay being about my grandmother and my mother and just the evolution of how you can be open about this kind of grief. And I'm very hyper aware that I have a different experience with my grief than my grandmother had with her grief, which she took to her grave. So my hope is that trajectory continues in our culture and of course around the world. And I also really appreciate the international perspective, Kate, that you brought to the panel today. So.
Anybody else?
I think similar the way more useful books while I was pregnant kind of suggested I should have certain resources on hand and know that certain things are possible. Think about nursing doulas and different people to call once the child was born, at least knowing what is a possible outcome and how to find those resources earlier would have really changed me. I probably wouldn't have read everything ahead of time, but to know possibilities and be at least a tiny bit prepared for possible things would have been helpful. And hopefully that's a future.
And this isn't, Allison, go ahead.
I think one thing that I recognized in writing this book and then sharing it with people was that for me, it was about, exploring infertility and the trauma of it, but that often the people that really connected with the work were queer folks who said, I've never read anything about IVF. I've never read anything except maybe like a how-to about pregnancy for queer folks and for lesbians in particular, and that it really made me think more deeply about intersectionality in my work and the ways that I needed to expand what I was writing about. And to me, being queer just seemed like really on the periphery of the experience, but that it was central for readers and audience members who really connected with that. And so I think that, like, in going forward, being more intersectional in, revealing my own experiences, but then understanding how intersectionality really can create community with these kind of creative works, and that for many of us, it's about loss or infertility, but there's a lot more going on there, and ways that we can connect with audiences or heal audiences.
So I have a sort of negative question, and I don't really want to end on a negative note, but I do want to sort of throw it out there. There's been some talk in the post-Me Too world about women who have sort of laid it all out on the table, who have told what has happened to them, who have watched, their stories blow up in the press, whatever. And then the caravan marches on, right? So you've put your life out on the table and it's been picked apart, and nothing changes. Maybe the writer who abused you gets another big prize. Is there anybody got any regrets? Anybody think maybe or maybe for your family members, what about your kids growing up and they're reading these things? Any cautions or any maybe lessons learned from the process that we've all been going through?
I always say that, if you're a writer and an artist and you're not telling the truth, then I don't know what you're doing. I really don't know what you're doing.
The only time you cannot tell the truth is when you're making a comic book.
Okay, right. This is Boise's perspective, and I agree. But you can tell the truth through telling lies too. That's fiction. So I feel like there's sort of this political realm that I feel like you're talking about, Catherine, which to me is different than the artistic realm. And that has different risks and different, potential benefits as well. So but I feel like in art, and art can be political. Most of my art is political, but not didactic in the same way that I feel like some of the stuff that you're talking about politically is.
Anybody else? Cool.
I was really worried about it and spent a lot of time asking my partner to read the collection, other writers, other intentionally mother writers. And I had a friend, I did an exchange, who's a therapist and a mother and a writer, and kind of really thought about it from different angles before I started submitting, and felt good ultimately about what I'd submitted. I know 100% there are always mistakes and something later I'll regret. But I did dedicate some time ahead of time kind of considering what it means for our child who eventually learned to read, and who will perhaps read the book.
All right, we are going to wrap it up, but I have a parting question, which is any works that have come out since your works that you want to recommend that you just cannot get out of your mind? Some writing. I just read some really interesting poems by Megan Leonard. So, I mean, any writers that you're just following right now on this subject? Anybody that everybody should be reading?
I'm in the midst of reading The Push by Ashley Aldring, which is a novel it's about a grieving mother. It's also about mothers who abandon their children. So it's complicated in ways that are really interesting to me. And don't spoil the ending because I haven't finished it, but it's really beautiful.
The Boston Review just published a really great article called Beyond Choice. And it's kind of looking at this issue that some of the other panelists were talking about, like about abortion rights and sort of this issue of losing children and the language that we use. But it's a really great article, and it does talk about our book, What God Is Honored Here, but it talks about another book that really made me want to check it out. It just came out, Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood by Michelle Goodwin from Cambridge University Press. And really talking about the rise in these anti-abortion laws in state legislatures across the country. And she also talks about Erica Hunt's new book of poetry, Jump the Clock, New and Selected Poems. So I'm looking forward to checking both.
All righty. Thank you, everybody. We're going to have to leave it here. On behalf of our readers and speakers today, Allison Blevins, Shannon Gibney, Chloe Yelena Miller, Whitney Roberts-Hill, Russia's Anna Starobinets, and me, Catherine E. Young. Thank you to everybody at 1455 Summerfest for inviting us to speak and read on this topic. Thank you for giving us a platform to share this information. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you, Catherine, for all of your organizing.